Joining me today is Steve Dunne, Industry Business Consulting Manager at Schneider Electric, who'll be speaking at IIR's Electricity Price and Market Dynamics Review Conference, which takes place on the 28th to 29th of April 2011 in Sydney. Hi Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
To start with, what have been the key drivers in electricity's huge price hikes in recent years?
Well, most of the demand has been from our population growth and the increase in the energy-hungry devices that people have been using, like air conditioners and so on. But those price increases have really been centred around the transmission and distribution area. I think most people imagine it's around generation, but it's actually transmission distribution. In other words, the poles and wires. So there is a reasonable basis for those price increases because the infrastructure is at the end of its useful life, and there hasn't been investment made during that period to bring up the standard. But really, that's not the only reason for those price increases. It's really because of the way that those bodies are now being regulated. And there are a number of factors which affect that. One of which is that the nominal cost of capital which they're being granted is actually higher than the actual cost of their capital. So when you're making big investments and you're obviously got a lot of capital expenditure, that can make a huge difference. And what's happening is that they've been granted this nominally higher interest rate, paying a lower interest rate. The rates paid by the consumer, of course, are based on the cost at the nominal rate, and the difference is being pocketed by the shareholders, which in most cases state governments. Most, except for Victoria, are state government owned. So they've got a vested interest in keeping it that way, but that's also pushing up prices. The system itself also has the onus on the regulator to respond to what the network operators are wanting, and they've got to prove that that is not justified. So the onus of proof is on the regulator, not on the network bodies. What this has meant is that the network bodies have been able to get quite large increases, and the regulator has very little chance of actually challenging that. Not only that, there's an appeal mechanism, and typically every decision that the regulator makes which they don't like is appealed. And most of those are won on appeal, and the cost of that appeal is then put into their budget for the following year, and so the consumer again pays them for the appeal. So from the network operator's point of view, if they challenge, then there's no loss, but there's a big gain. The other thing which they can do is they can challenge individual decisions and not have the whole decision reviewed. So there's very little incentive in that, really, for them to become more efficient, but rather to make huge capital expenditure, and the more they do that, the more profit they make, but the consumer pays for that. So I guess what I'm saying is the huge price rises have a rational basis to them in terms of the need for that capital expenditure on renewing the network, but there's also a regulatory incentive there which has pushed them up beyond what they should be.
Can you explain the theory behind demand management systems?
Okay. Well, in the electricity industry, the term demand management is used to refer to actions which change the electricity demand on the system, and it's been used to refer to a wide range of activities, and this includes actions taken on the customer's side of the electricity meter, the demand side, such as energy efficiency measures and power factor correction, also arrangements for reducing loads on request, such as interruptibility contracts and direct load control. Also things like fuel switching, changing from electricity to gas and water heating. And also distributed generation, so using generators in office buildings or photovoltaics modules on rooftops. But the primary objective of all this has typically been to relieve the constraints on the distribution and all the transmission networks, and then deferring that expenditure, avoiding the need to expand the electricity supply network. So really this has been driven by the network suppliers. From the customer's point of view, it should lead to lower prices in the wholesale electricity market, increased focus on energy efficiency and also some reduced greenhouse gas emissions. But often the focus is on peak demand because the infrastructure has been built to cope with that maximum load. Any reduction in the maximum load will have the greatest impact on the infrastructure demand. Load shifting can help reduce this demand without necessarily reducing the amount of electricity consumed. So, for example, pumping during off-peak hours. It's possible, however, to permanently reduce the base load by using that energy more efficiently. For example, by installing more efficient motors or using variable speed drives.
How can a company develop smart mechanisms for reducing peak demand and minimising price impacts?
Okay. Well, I think one of the key things they can do is install a metering system that provides some real-time data on energy consumption. We found that many companies have a meter on the incomer, but very little sub-metering, so they don't really know where their energy is being used, and it's very hard to be smart if you don't know what's going on. You can reduce the network charges. Most companies charge a network charge, which is basically the expense of providing network to that business, and that's based on their expected demand. So the companies usually ask what they expect the demand to be in the coming period, and then they're charged a fee for that. If the company goes above that expected rate, then they're hit with a penalty. So without accurate data, most companies overestimate how much the demand is going to be so they can avoid the penalty charges. If you've got a very good, accurate, real-time system, you can have more accurate information about what your network demand is going to be. And more importantly, when you're approaching those peaks where you're going to be hit with a penalty, if you've got real-time data, you can begin to shift some loads and then avoid having the penalty. So in that way, you can actually lower your network charges. The other thing, of course, is reducing your base load. In other words, how much energy you're using when pretty well everything is turned off, or just your normal energy consumption. So energy efficient measures I've talked about before are important here. Things like installing energy efficient devices. 60% of electricity consumed in most is used by motors. So things like variable speed drives can reduce that consumption by about 20% if it's currently being controlled by a damper or a valve or something like that. And also you can introduce high efficiency motors in some circumstances, and that will also reduce the energy consumption. But I think the more interesting one is we have companies with quite perhaps efficient equipment, but it's running when it doesn't need to. So part of the plant may be stopped, and yet the conveyor belts and fans and so on may all be running, and that's consuming energy unnecessarily. So it's important to look at all those things which are consuming energy and make sure that you've minimised those. And of course the other thing is that load shedding. I referred to that earlier in terms of avoiding peak demand. But that can be controlled very much if you've got an accurate metering system, particularly attached to your control system, and you can begin to shed those loads, but you really need to understand the implications of that, not just for your energy consumption, but also for production. So being able to have that information available on your consumption in real time and also your production data so that you can make sensible decisions about the energy production as opposed to production impacts.
What are the solutions for reform of the nation's electricity sector?
Well, if I go back to what I talked about before as to why energy prices are so high, I think we need to put the onus on the network providers to justify any proposed expenditure and demonstrate efficiency measures rather than have that on the regulator. I think they also need to use the actual rate of return on capital rather than an artificially high nominal rate. And that's because basically these are fairly low risk industries. They're unlike other companies. that don't have a monopoly, they can actually control their what they can charge the customers. So the risk is low, and that's why the banks are prepared to lend them at a lower level. So we should take that into account and not have this artificially high rate. I think there needs to be greater independence to the regulator, and I think the regulator should actually involve users in evaluating the arguments put forward if we put the onus back on the network providers. And I think the appeals mechanism should be such that if they do appeal on a particular point, then the whole decision is back for review, not just part of it, so as they could lose some of the things they've gained in the initial run. And also there should be a penalty for for frivolous appeals. In other words, if the appeal really doesn't have merit, then they should not be able to claim the expense of that in the following year.
You're speaking at IIR's Electricity Price and Market Dynamics Review Conference, which takes place on the 28th to 29th of April 2011 in Sydney. What will be some of the key aspects that we'll be focusing on in your presentation?
Well, the presentation will focus on the practical and cost-effective ways that companies can reduce the total amount of energy they use, as well as how they can reduce their peak demand, and therefore the network charges if they're buying on the spot market. So we want to be able to help them to capitalise on their investment that they may have in their control system, and developing a metering system that will help them to identify those opportunities to save energy, and also help them to be able to shed loads, as we talked about before.
Steve Dunne, many thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thank you.